There, I'm Isan Ali A.A. Shaw, and you're watching me on YouTube and live. It's the seventh episode of History of Globalization and Market. If you remember, we started our journey uh, from the ancient globalization, Alexander the Great, ancient Rome's and Greek, uh, the time of ancient Rome and Greece. Then we discuss the wars in the Middle Ages, the whole Middle Ages. Then Mongolian Empire and the Viking empires. Then we move to the Renaissance period, Reformation period, time of secret societies. Then we discussed industrialization, and after that we discussed in detail about the evolution. Last week we had a very detailed discussion on the First World War. That was the time when the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire collapsed, and that's how the beginning of the New World. That was the dawn of beginning of the New World, or beginning of the new globalization and the global period. And today we are going to focus on the Second World War. And my guest is Edward Konowicz. He has joined us from Virginia, United States.
Yeah, hi
Hi, Ed.
everybody.
Hi, Ed. How are you?
Well, tired from all the study, but otherwise pretty
Okay.
good.
Well,
I, you
you
know,
were right. It was the link you sent me. It was a very details there, and there were so many factors that are involved.
yeah, there is so many things. So
Hmm.
the art of scholarship is to find the most important
Hmm.
items and
Hmm.
connect the dots, which is how do we summarize World War II? What was it really about? Because we
Hmm.
could spend 10,000 pages in details.
Hmm.
And I think it was about two things.
Okay.
One is the rise of nationalism,
Hmm.
and two is oil supplies.
Hmm.
But should I
And
just go? Okay. It really
okay,
began in Asia, and it
okay.
began in Asia. And this is a very strange thing. The Qing dynasty, which is
Hmm.
spelled Qing,
Hmm.
was falling apart. I think it fell apart about 1905.
Hmm.
And the
I
reason
think
is,
the First World War, I think the same thing happened in the First World War. The British Empire, the reason uh, for pushing down the Ottoman Empire is to control in the Middle East and over the to control over the oil resources.
yes, that's correct. And
Hmm.
I'm going to start from the end of World War One
Hmm.
till then introduce World War II. And you're
Hmm.
correct. The World War One emphasis, which you don't get in history books, was the destruction of the Ottoman Empire and
Hmm.
the establishment of Iraq and eventually Saudi Arabia for Britain to control the oil supplies of Europe.
Hmm.
So what we're looking at the end of World War One, Britain
Hmm.
had planned to control the oil fields.
Hmm.
In China, it was something slightly different,
Hmm.
which was just before World War One, the Chinese dynasty, the Qing, was falling
Hmm.
apart, and that was
Hmm.
because they failed to industrialize.
Hmm.
So the revolutionaries wanted to basically get rid of the emperor so that China could be a modern nation. And
Hmm.
so you have the rise of different factions, and eventually communism. But you first had the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen, and they
Hmm.
were called republicans because
Hmm.
republican meant you were no longer an empire or a monarchy, you were a secular government. And To some extent, that's the overthrow of the imperial rule by the secret societies, particularly the warrior class. The same thing happened in Europe, but it was hidden. But what we're seeing in World War II, and it goes back to World War One, is as the Chinese emperor's control over the country collapsed, particularly the Japanese went into the vacuum. And the issue largely was Manchuria, which was mineral supplies, iron, coal. The Japanese had no minerals, and both the Japanese and the Germans wanted what the Germans call Lebensraum. They wanted more room for their population. So Germany was looking at absorbing Poland and parts of Russia, and Japan was looking at absorbing Manchuria and Korea and parts of China for their own populations. But the issue, and it's very strange,
Mhm.
the issue which failed in dynastic China was they couldn't get the railroads going for the logistics. They couldn't get the minerals and the um, technology needed to trade with other nations. China was used to being self-efficient,
Mhm.
and they had a closed door. In a modern world, you have to basically trade with other countries. So
Mhm.
the Japanese came in, and the Japanese were very aggressive.
Mhm.
So there was two Sino being China, Japanese wars, and the Chinese themselves today feel the actual World War II began in 1931.
Yeah,
A
and
lot,
I think the same thing. I think they in their history books that the Second World War to the Chinese is comprised of 14 or 16 years, I think, or
right?
more than, yes, 18 years, I think.
Yeah, and they're somewhat correct because once Japan invaded Manchuria, this was
Mhm.
eventual conflict, and the question that was going on in China: how would they reunify in order to expel the Japanese? And
Yes.
China is so big, is so
Yeah.
large, even though Japan had superior technology and a
Mm-hmm.
large armies and did a lot of massacres. Japan was in many ways more cruel than the Germans. They
Mm-hmm.
established even horrible medical experiments in which they would infect people and dissect them while they were alive.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese were extremely brutal, and even today, most of the Chinese have a lot of animosity. So do the South Koreans towards the
Mm-hmm.
Japanese. And
Yes.
that was under the Emperor Hirohito.
Mm-hmm. And
So it's
they still
it,
have the animosity against Japanese, and Koreans also have the enmity towards the Japanese even today.
yes, even today.
Mm-hmm.
The but the strangest thing is the Japanese also had good points, like they supported Sun Yat-sen,
Mm-hmm.
and there was initially, and we see that all the way back to Philip IV of France around 1300.
Mm-hmm.
There was Christians all the way to China, Nestorian Christians,
Mm-hmm.
and I think, and this is a question I'm going to raise with globalization, is how do
Okay.
you unify or connect people in terms of mind control?
Mm-hmm.
So first, there was an attempt of unifying the Eurasian continent with Buddhism, and that was
Mm-hmm.
Genghis and Kublai Khan, particularly
Mm-hmm.
Genghis Khan, try to unify Europe and Asia with some freedom of religion, but an emphasis on Buddhism. When
Mm-hmm.
that failed, then we had a temporary spread of Christianity, and in China, up to about 10 million Christians were massacred.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, what we have in World War II is how Eurasia was going to be united was communism.
Mm-hmm.
So we see this political philosophy, but I want to get back to the two major themes
Okay.
besides the mind control. See,
Okay.
mind control shifted. to nationalism. Before it
Mhm.
used to be religion, and then the
Yes.
religion was transferred to the Communist
True.
International, which
Mhm.
was now instead of believing in God, you believed in socialism. You
Yes.
believed in
To
the
some
state.
to some extent, we can call it patriotism.
Yeah, patriotism.
Yes.
So patriotism was what was developing as the mind control in World War II. So it was
Mhm.
critical
Mhm.
to unify China so they could be patriotic and get the Japanese out.
Mhm.
And this was going on in Europe with the
Mhm.
so-called Jewish villages, the shtetls in
Mhm.
Eastern Europe. It was even going on before, which was the PAL. Millions of Jews were supposed to settle in Central Eastern Europe in villages. And
Yes.
sometimes there were pogroms, which is extermination campaigns against them, even by the Russians.
Mhm.
And and what I think that was, and I'm going to develop these themes of nationalism
Okay.
and technology.
Mhm.
But I think that was because it doesn't make any sense to me. You don't go to Europe and see
Mhm.
millions of Arabs in villages. You don't
Mhm.
go to Europe and see millions of Egyptian or Tunisians in
Mhm.
villages in Europe. You don't go
Mhm.
and see millions of Persians in Europe, but you do go and
Mhm.
see millions of Jews.
Mhm.
I don't believe most of those Jews migrated from Israel. I think it was the collapse of the Khazarian Empire.
Mhm.
The Khazarian Empire was Jewish. And the reason why it was Jewish, it didn't want to be dominated by
Mhm.
the Islamic political powers of the Middle East. And it didn't
Mhm.
want to be dominated by the Roman Christianity. So this empire of Central Europe
Mhm.
chose to be Jewish.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
I
we
think
have a
if you,
comment. We have a comment here.
yeah, that's true, Mike. Nationalism is wavering allegiance,
Yes.
unwavering mind control. I'm not going to
Yes.
call allegiance, it's mind control, patriotism.
Yes. Yes.
And of
It,
course,
it
that's
shifted. It shifted
it's
from religion to nationalism, then patriotism. The concept, the underlying concept, is the same, and that is to control the minds of people.
yeah, and a lot of this is logistics or supplies, and I'm going to be
Mhm.
discussing it in terms of railroads
Mhm.
and oil, which is
Mhm.
England during World War One knew railroads made a difference. They went into the Middle East, they went to India, Africa,
Mhm.
and they built and controlled railroads, which is part of logistics or supplies. And they set up these Arab
Mhm.
kingdoms to control the oil.
Yes.
And China wasn't quite ready for this. This is the strangest thing.
Yes.
The
China wasn't
Chinese,
ready in the.
the
Yes.
Chinese were building railroads in Europe, United States, all over the world, but not in China.
Yes.
Isn't that crazy?
Yes, it doesn't make sense. It also
And
doesn't make sense that China wasn't even ready for the Second World War until he gets China. She gets the support from the Soviets.
yeah, from the Soviets, and because of the
Yes.
Russian support, also American support, aerial
Yes.
support over the Himalayas.
Mm-hmm.
China got a lot of support because Japan was expanding very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and what after the let me get this clear: the Japanese invaded Manchuria, controlled the railroads. The
Mm-hmm.
Soviets were there because of the railroads, and China couldn't really quite industrialize and get into the trade, so
Mm-hmm.
Japan went into the vacuum. And
Mm-hmm.
Japan was so aggressive in this period, 1931 to 1937, that by
Mm-hmm.
the 40s, Roosevelt put an
Mm-hmm.
embargo and freeze Japanese assets so they couldn't get oil. The Japanese had someplace between 2 to 3 years left of
Mm-hmm.
oil, so they had to invade Indochina, Southeast Asia, and the
Mm-hmm.
Indonesian area with Malaysia, Singapore. They were
Mm-hmm.
forced to go for oil and rubber, and the U.S. Knew this. So they set
Yes.
up an economic blockade,
Mhm.
and Japan knew they had to go and invade the Philippines and Vietnam and other places for their
Mhm.
supplies.
Yes.
So this is an oil question. The
Mm.
US and Britain were controlling oil, particularly Britain.
Mhm.
Japanese were blocked from oil. They were
Mhm.
blocked from minerals, invaded China, and then the US placed an embargo on them, an economic blockade, which is
Mhm.
before war, there's an economic blockade like today. We're under an
Mhm.
economic blockade today. So before
Yes.
war, your first stage is an economic blockade. So the United States placed an economic blockade on Japan.
Mhm.
Japan had built a powerful navy that even defeated the Russians in the battle.
Mhm.
Japan had, they brag about the Iowa class battleships in the US with 16-inch guns.
Mhm.
Japan had 18-inch guns on two of
Mhm.
their battleships. So,
Mhm.
so, but the Japanese knew if they invaded the Philippines, which was connected with the United States, they would be
Mhm.
attacked by the United States. So they decided to take a step ahead of time and attack at Pearl Harbor and
Mhm.
destroy much of the fleet at Pearl Harbor. But
Mhm.
U.S. intelligence knew it and pulled out the carriers.
Mhm.
The advanced military science at that time knew that though
Mhm.
Japan had superior battleships, which really counted with superior aircraft carriers, to be able to launch planes with torpedoes and bombs to attack the other ships. So the U.S.
Mhm.
protected its aircraft carriers, and I think let Japan hit Pearl Harbor. I think the
Mhm.
code was cracked, and Americans knew that. So that
Mhm.
that was the beginning of World War II for the United States. The
Mhm.
beginning in Europe was the invasion of Poland in
Mhm.
1937.
I think
So,
the event of Pearl Harbor made it easier, and that was the point. The Pearl Harbor was the main point when the U.S. officially entered the Second World War.
yes,
Mhm.
but they were supplying England, and
Mhm.
the big thing was we can see this in the movies and everything, the German
Mhm.
nationalism.
Mhm.
Well, what we're
Yes.
seeing is the rise of nationalism.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is you would think these countries have some allegiance, and they don't. There's no allegiance to the people or other
Mhm.
countries. In World
Yes.
War One, Japan declared war on Germany in World War One.
Yes. Yes. And
Now,
they became allied in the Second World War.
yeah,
Soon
so they
after that.
switched.
Yes.
They actually switched.
So
So
your point is perfectly right that there's no allegiance among countries or among their people.
right. And what happened in Europe is very interesting. That the so-called Jewish question, which I don't um, agree with how it's framed. I think Jewish people were part of it. I
Mhm.
think it was the village question. It
Mhm.
was how do you deal with all these highly educated engineers, lawyers, doctors that were living in villages, didn't
Mhm.
have telephones, electricity, didn't have
Mhm.
modern technology. And the
Mhm.
German solution was kill them, exterminate them.
Mhm. Mhm. I think before the German execution of Jews and Jewish people, and I think it
Well,
was
it was
first
any
started by
people.
the Russians.
I don't want to frame it as just as, that's the propaganda. It was just the
Mhm.
Jewish people. It wasn't
Mhm.
just the Jewish people. It was
They were
communists
killing.
who
Mhm.
were not anyone who was not a nationalist, anyone who
Mhm.
was not under a country. So once in World War One, the Balfour Agreement, if you were
Mhm.
Jewish and you were in Israel, that was fine because you were
Mhm.
under patriotism.
Mhm.
But if you were in Eastern Europe and you were not under patriotism, you were Jewish, that was no
Mhm.
good. So that
Okay.
applied to gypsies, it
Mhm.
applied to communists,
Mhm.
because Hitler said you have to be under nationalism.
Mhm.
So those people, which largely was, I think, the Jews, which I'm not disagreeing with, But
Mhm.
I think many of them were Khazarian,
Mhm.
that the Jewish people who did not have allegiance directly to the state, whose
Mhm.
religion separated them from it,
Mhm. From
they
the
were going to be,
nationalism.
yeah, they were going to be exterminated. And the
Mhm.
exception was, of course, Russia, which became the Communist International Soviets. So, of course,
Mhm.
Hitler would want to destroy the Soviet Union because it wasn't moving towards nationalism, was moving towards international communism.
So my point was that before the extermination of nationalist or Jewish people started by the Hitler, I think it was Soviet. They were the first. They started extermination of Jewish people.
Well, the Russians did.
Yeah, the
The
Russians. Yes.
Soviets claimed they were not doing it. They had their
Hmm.
labor camps.
Hmm.
A lot of people did die, but the
Hmm.
labor camps were nowhere as bad as the Germans at times.
Hmm.
And of course, we now have a dispute. The so-called Holocaust denials.
Hmm.
Um, they're the next to the Russians, Germans
Hmm.
sometimes look good. I mean, the Russians did carry out a lot of extermination. That
Yes.
was even the issue with General Patton. He felt that we were more in disagreement with the Russians, the US, than we were with the Germans. But they all
Hmm.
committed war crimes. They all committed crimes against humanity. There was no good country.
Yes,
Because
you're right.
England and United States and Russia were rotten countries does not make Germany a good country.
Yes.
We have this two-party system. You're supposed to take sides. If one
Mhm,
side is bad, you're supposed to see the other side is good. And let me
mhm,
say this, because the
mhm.
US, Britain, and Russia committed horrendous war crimes, does not make the Germans good.
Yes,
And
they
I
all.
don't know how people want to see them as heroes,
Mhm,
because what they particularly did to Poland,
mhm,
which was Hitler and Stalin betrayed their own people and
mhm.
made a pact to dissolve Poland, to destroy Poland.
Yes.
And Poland had expected England and France to come to their aid. England and France did declare war 2 or so days after the German invasions,
Mhm,
but they didn't really come to the aid of the Poles. And the Poles did have modern army.
mhm.
We're given this German propaganda. They fought German tanks on horses. It's not true.
Yes.
They were not given the support. The
Yes.
Allies said they would support them. They didn't. And then they could have held off the Germans for a while. But now
Mhm,
the Soviet Union invaded it, which is
mhm,
Stalin and Hitler had a deal to divide up and destroy Poland.
mhm,
And I think why they had that deal, if you read history, a Nobel Prize winner, I forget his name, very difficult Polish name to
mhm,
pronounce. In Poland, they were discussing philosophy, what's masonry, what are different religions, what's
mhm.
communism. And Polish had an intellectual revival where these secret societies were actually openly discussed.
Yes.
So
And
because of
I think that's how the beginning of the Second World War, uh, that Germans they invaded the Poland, and the Polish expected uh, uh, a spur from the British and the French, but they never gave any spur to the Polish people.
never real support. And then the
Yes.
Soviets attacked the other half.
Hmm.
And it was like an outrage. Poland was being sacrificed,
Yes.
and
Uh,
uh,
before the
and
World War, before the
Stalin
second.
and Hitler, these were gangsters.
Yes,
I mean,
you're
just
right.
gangsters making a deal and will betray each other and kill each other, try to kill each
Hmm.
other later.
Yes.
So,
And the same thing, British and Soviets and the Americans, they did the same. After the Second World War, they betrayed the Polish people.
right, these leaders have no allegiance to their agreement or to their own
Mm.
people. The
Yes.
people are supposed to have allegiance to these leaders.
Yes.
That's mind control.
Yeah.
And it's most dangerous. Years ago, in 50 to 100 years ago, actually, it's
Mhm.
100. I'm getting old. It's over
Okay.
100 years ago. If you said
Mhm.
something about Christianity, you were risking your life.
Yeah. Even
Today is,
today, I live in a Muslim country. If you say anything about the Muslim or Islam, then you also you are risking your life.
yeah, but Islam is seen as a nation, which is
Mm-hmm.
nationalism is not as strong as religion, like in
Yes.
the Middle Ages in Europe. Religion
Mm-hmm.
is the mind control in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. And also all the in the Muslim countries.
Right. North
Mm-hmm.
Africa and other places. It's
Yeah.
a large part. But patriotism is the mind control in the United States and Europe, and it's falling. The mind
Mm-hmm.
control of patriotism is collapsing, particularly as people see how wrongful the wars are.
Mm-hmm.
So what's substituting today is the corporate science, which is
Mm-hmm.
these international corporations who are the new empires have
Mm-hmm.
corrupt science. They pay off scientists, and now we're supposed to believe their scientists tell us the truth.
Mm-hmm. I
But
think
let's get back
like
to let's
okay.
get back to World
One
War II.
Okay, there's one thing I would like to add that you are right. The countries they don't have or the alliances the countries have. There's no such thing as allegiance to the countries, to other countries, to neighbors, and also to the people. The same thing is happening today in our world today. We see a lot of bloodshed, wars in different parts of the world, and no one goes there to help those people. Okay, back to the.
No.
We should go back to the Second World War.
So the Second World War is basically China trying to regroup
Hmm.
and develop an integrated army,
Hmm.
first with Chiang Kai-shek, and then the communists with support from the Soviets, which are the Russians, were able to consolidate control over China. But first, they had to
Hmm.
retreat, and this
Okay,
is similar to
we
what
have
happened
got a
to
comment.
the.
We
Okay,
have got a comment.
yeah, that's true. Fascist regimes have emerged with the
Mhm.
fervor of nationalism, with the notions of superiority, especially when
Mhm.
it comes to ethnicity and religion. And what
Mhm.
happened in China and Russia during World War II is no longer based on religion.
Yes.
Communism was the new sort of secular Buddhism to unify Eurasia.
Yes.
And right after World War II, the Soviet Union, the empire was not based on religion, it's based on materialistic science, like the
Mhm.
Nazis were based on
Mhm.
materialistic science. And they basically incorporated much of Eastern and Central Europe under the Soviet bloc.
Yes.
Soviet bloc is a propaganda bloc. We're now
Mhm.
under a global bloc of corporations controlling the world, particularly pharmaceutical racketeering. But let's
Mhm.
get back
Well,
to China. So
okay.
the big thing,
I think I would like to say here that now we are in the world in a block of globalization, so-called globalization. Okay.
yeah.
Back to the China.
So China had to regroup, and it was so big, like Russia or the
Mhm.
Soviet Union. Mao
Mhm.
Zedong retreated. I think it was something like 3,000 miles they walked
Mhm.
to the interior. And though
Mhm.
Japan had very efficient, powerful armies, they couldn't
Mhm.
spread over that much territory.
Mhm.
So just like Russia gave up large sections of the land to Napoleon and then to Hitler, is such an expansive amount of land, there
Mhm.
was a problem of logistics, which is supplies.
Mhm.
So the Japanese could not occupy China, it was too big.
Mhm.
And this is the amazing thing of China and mind control. China is one
Mhm.
of the largest countries in the world, and
Mhm.
so is the Soviet Union was and Russia was. But
Mhm.
China was based on mind control by a bureaucracy up to the emperor. It wasn't based on railroads. The
Yes.
development of Russia was based on railroads, like the development The British Empire was based on railroads. So
Mhm.
China stayed somewhat underdeveloped since this bureaucracy was based more on the emperor and
Mhm.
control of the Qing dynasty.
Mhm.
And the Qing dynasty were from the Manchuria area. And there's
Mhm.
so many secret societies in China.
Mhm.
There are a huge amount, even today, of organized crime
Mhm.
from China. And that's the same thing with Russia. Russia today has huge amounts of organized crime influencing them. In
Mhm.
the United States, it tends to be more based on corporations, where the
Mhm.
government is more involved in organized crime, particularly the local police and
Mhm.
prostitution, drugs, and where what rose out of World War II largely was the mafias, the Russian mafia, the
Mhm.
Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, the Chinese mafia, the triads,
Mhm.
the Italian mafia, the Sicilian, and then um, on top of this were the English Empire, the American and English Empire, and they've collapsed now. It's a
Mhm.
global control, but I want to get back. So World War II was really shifting
Mhm.
the control from religion
Mhm.
to
To yes.
patriotism. Even in China, even in
Mhm.
communist China, the shift of mind control was patriotism. So it
Mhm.
felt if you were undermining China as American intelligence, or you were in Russia and you were an American spy, they had
Mhm.
no, even today they feel they can kill you if you're accused of being a British or American spy.
Okay.
And so we see the um, communism has taken a second step
Mhm.
to oligarchy, which is both oligarchy is rising and did rise in Russia. And this is
Mhm.
where Karl Marx was wrong. Karl Marx had a historical model that,
Mhm.
that feudalism would evolve to capitalism and capitalism would evolve to communism. And it's
Mhm.
actually wrong.
Okay.
Feudalism evolved in China and Russia into communism, and then from
Mhm.
communism evolved into capitalism or oligarchy.
Mhm.
Marx was wrong.
Okay.
Russia and China proved it,
Okay.
which was communism was not a result of capitalism.
Mhm.
Capitalism was the result of communism. Now,
Mhm.
what does that mean? It has to do with logistics in Eastern and Central Europe. You had
Mhm.
all these village people.
Mhm.
It was difficult to modernize. And
Mhm.
a lot of them were poor. Over 30% of the Jews, 30% of the Jews of Eastern and Central Europe were on welfare.
Mhm.
But the Jewish communities were so socially responsible. People had free medical care, shelter, food. The Jewish
Mhm.
communities of Eastern Europe took care of their own and other people too. They didn't allow people to starve or be poor.
Mhm.
So we see a more non centralized sense of government subsidy. It's not a
Mhm.
government. It was personal charity, and a lot of
Mhm.
people don't recognize. And it's even today. It's just like and I was raised Christian, but
Mhm.
most Christians are not as charitable as Jews or
Mhm.
as Islamic people. They
Mhm.
take charity more serious, which is if someone in their community is poor, they feel an obligation to those who are poor in their
Yes.
religion.
Mhm.
And that's what bothered the Germans. You don't
Mhm.
take care of each other, the government will decide.
Yes, and
So
that was the
The Jews,
nationalism,
right? The Jews were
patriotism.
hated because they
Mhm.
weren't based on nationalism; they were
Mhm.
based on their community support, the village.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the Russians could not justify it under the Soviets.
Mhm.
because a lot of the Soviet Communist Revolution was done by Jewish people.
Mhm.
So the Germans associated Jews with communism because they had a social welfare system. And
Yes.
even today,
Mhm.
United States and England, like in back in Dickens' time with extreme
Mhm.
poverty and starvation, even
Mhm.
today, the United States and Britain demonize community support. If the community supports the poor, provides hospitalization, provides
Mhm.
shelter, they're
Mhm.
seen as communists and monsters for helping the poor.
Yes, and I think that is the good thing about the society in which I live in. The good thing, one of those good things I like about my society, is the charity and the social welfare system. Even someone dies in our community, people go to the graveyard collectively whenever they get time. They then collectively they dig up the grave for the deceased person, and they go after the to the deceased family's house and sympathize with them. And if they could help them or pay off the deceased person's debt, or anywhere they help them. And I have personally visited graveyard many times and dug up the graves for many people. It's a something that you do it for the society, for the people.
Yeah, and for some reason, capitalism, particularly English
Hmm.
capitalism and American capitalism, they
Hmm.
hate the poor.
Yes,
They treat the poor as subhuman.
yes. If you don't have money, you are nothing. You have money, so you are at the top. Don't have money, at the bottom. So there's no middle ground.
Right. If you're poor, you're lazy, you're stupid,
Yes.
you're a criminal, you're a drug addict, you're an alcoholic.
Hmm.
And
Just label those people. Label them.
now, what I tell capitalists that talk like that,
Hmm.
I'm not a communist. I'm
Okay.
for community support. I think
Hmm.
the Eastern Central European shtetls and villages were kind of an ideal at times that
Hmm.
the community would get together, like you said, with funerals, but not only
Yeah.
funerals, with people's medical needs, with their
Yes.
educational needs, a lot of scholarships,
Hmm.
particularly for students that worked hard. They
Hmm.
would support them. Is more the human ideal. And what I tell
Yes.
capitalists who
Hmm.
are crazy, they are crazy, some of them. They're just so
Yes.
cruel. They don't care if
Hmm.
people are starving or dying on the street. But I
Hmm.
tell them, well, yes, there are drug addicts and criminals among the poor, but there's
Hmm.
just as many drug addicts and criminals among the rich.
Yes.
We go lie
Yes,
to me
it's a good
about Hollywood and tell me there's not as many criminals and drug addicts in Hollywood as there are in the homeless in Los Angeles. It's just they have
Yes.
so much money. When they're caught
Mhm.
with drugs, they go to a drug rehabilitation program.
A poor person,
When a
when a poor
go,
person is caught, he goes to the jail.
goes to the jail, the wealthy
Mm.
person goes to drug rehabilitation,
Yes.
it's blatant.
Mm-hmm.
It's blatant oligarchy cruelism.
Mm-hmm.
but but people are quote patriotic, so
Mm-hmm.
capitalism was identified with American patriotism. Capitalism in England or Britain was identified with patriotism and the king and the queen. They're all supposed to cheer on the patriotism, and
Mm-hmm.
then that gets with the poor. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
issue is there's a real issue when we get to communism with the
Mm-hmm.
state controlling charity.
Mm-hmm.
We get what we have today is corporate science where the corporations and their interest in medicine become
Mm-hmm.
mandatory, which is medicine was used not only in Germany but in the Soviet Union as a
Mm-hmm.
political tool of repression. Instead of having an inquisition of bishops, you had
Mm-hmm.
a psychiatrist that could be used against a whistleblower or a political dissident. A whistleblower could be drugged and damaged like Julian Assange, not only in prison for blowing the whistle on war crimes,
Mm-hmm.
but actually damaged with psychiatric drugs, claiming they were helping him.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in a mess, but I want to get back to World War II.
Okay.
Okay, we looked at China had a industrialization problem.
Hmm.
The
It was
Japanese
slow.
came in. The
Yes.
Japanese attacked America to protect their flank
Hmm.
because of economic blockade. They had to go into the Philippines.
Hmm.
And they were afraid the U.S. would attack them in the Philippines. So they decided to take out their ships. The U.S.
Hmm.
knew about it, apparently, and
Hmm.
removed the aircraft carriers because the feeling was the aircraft carriers would be more important than the battleships.
Hmm.
And the US position was simply they had more population and more production capability to win against the Germans and the Japanese. Japanese had a superior fighter, the Zero had superior ships and
Hmm.
torpedoes that worked. A lot of US torpedoes did not work, which was
Hmm.
a big problem for submarine warfare. But so the United States, which was the big Pacific power,
Hmm.
was able to defeat Japan. And defeating Japan,
Hmm.
China regrouped as Communist China under Mao Zedong, and the U.S. went into a policy of containment. But that's World War II in the Pacific theater. Started about 1931 with the collapse of China and the invasion of
Hmm.
Japan. But China was too big for Japan to occupy. Mao Zedong was aware of that, retreated 3,000 miles, spread the Japanese influence, and the Chinese had enough support from the Russians and from the
The
Soviets,
Americans.
from the United States, that and United States directly attacked Japan, that
Hmm.
China emerged as a patriotic communist nation.
Hmm.
The Soviet Union emerged as a predecessor to what we're under today, which was a global empire
Hmm.
that included much of Central and Eastern Europe and much of Asia under
Hmm.
materialistic science. And that
Hmm.
collapsed with Chernobyl because people's
Hmm.
confidence in engineering collapsed. But in the meantime, what World War II was about was Britain consolidating its interest and control of oil in the Middle East and North Africa.
Hmm.
Germany was blockaded from that oil, so they had to go into North Africa. They had to go into parts of Russia for oil and gas.
Hmm.
So Hitler, after making a pact with Stalin to destroy Poland,
Hmm.
turned on Stalin. Stalin couldn't believe he was tricked.
Hmm.
His advisors told him Hitler would attack. Stalin would not listen,
Hmm.
and Hitler attacked and destroyed someplace
Hmm.
between 40 to 100 million Russians.
Hmm.
Just think about that number,
Hmm.
40 to 100 million Russians and Eastern Europeans were destroyed in the battles between the Soviet Union and Germany. So this is
I think
massive.
I think that was the biggest mistake of Hitler's career and the Second World War, and that was the turning point in history.
Well, we think these leaders are allegiance to their country. It's not true.
Mm.
Hitler did not
Yes.
have allegiance to Germany. That was a fake.
Mm. Yes.
He was on population control. He
Mm-hmm.
was to kill, including Germans and French and Italians, he was to kill as many people as possible. His
Mm-hmm.
generals realized that because he
Mm-hmm.
was putting them on suicidal missions in Russia. And
Mm-hmm.
then they plotted to assassinate Hitler. We
I
know,
think it was in one of his speeches he told the soldiers that kill women, children, men, women, and everyone
yes,
to get the land. That was the only way to for the Germans to take to, to take
and
over the
that was
world.
with regards to Poland. When they
Yes,
invaded Poland, he said, kill everyone.
yes.
And but the Polish had after World War I and Germany lost, they had been discriminatory against German population areas.
Mhm.
So Hitler justified he was coming in to protect the German populations of Polish cities.
Mhm.
The um, the thing with the whole World War II, it becomes evident as it was in World War One. The patriotism is mind control. The elite,
Yeah.
these leaders, including Hitler, really were lying. They had no
Yeah.
allegiance to Germany. He was destroying Germany, and his generals
Mhm.
realized that.
Mhm. I think they were delusional. They wanted to create the imaginary world that they had in their mind in the real life.
Yeah, they thought they had a
And
superior country and superior
mhm.
race. They didn't
Yes,
understand Hitler was a puppet of global forces.
yes.
And we have these Holocaust denials who deny the millions of people killed,
Mhm.
millions,
And
whether they were by disease. I
mhm.
think the gas chambers were exaggerated, though they were there. Of course, the Germans would get rid of them and bury them. But the
Mhm.
point was Hitler destroyed Germany.
Yes. And
And
also millions of other people.
yes, which is these leaders have no allegiance to their country.
Yes.
They're I hate to say it, but they're
Okay.
they're evil.
Yes, you're
They're
right. They are
evil.
evil. Yes,
The
I
people are
agree.
and people are comfortable following evil leaders.
Yes.
More
Even
evil,
today.
more comfortable the people are.
Yes,
We
even today.
figure that out.
Yeah.
And they'll go give their lives, they'll go kill women and children, they'll go
Mhm.
bomb, they'll go make these weaponry, they'll
Mhm.
bankrupt their country on war.
Mhm.
And so patriotism was the big mind control
Yeah,
of World
and
War
I
II.
think that's the main thing. That first you have to control the minds of people. It is either through nationalism, religion, patriotism, or anything. First, you just have to control their minds. Then they will do what the heck ever you want them to do.
Yeah, now it's drugs. Now it's
Yes,
drug lords ruling the world through the
yes,
pharmaceutical industry. The
yes,
mind control is medicine,
yes.
psychiatry, vaccination, which is
Mhm,
weaken the body's defenses, which is the immunity system. The immunity
mhm,
system is your self defense.
mhm,
Weaken self defense with toxins
mhm,
so that these oligarchs, these psychopaths that have been
mhm,
ruling the human race for thousands of years can
mhm,
maintain their mind control over people. And they have no
mhm.
allegiance.
Yes. One thing we agree on that they have no allegiance with anyone.
Anyway,
Yes.
and they're laughing at people. They're laughing
Yes.
at people for following them because they have no
Mhm.
allegiance.
Yes.
I mean,
It's a
you
propaganda.
see it, you can see the mocking. You can see the
Mhm.
mocking when Hitler took Paris, France. He does this
Mhm.
little jig in
Mhm.
public, and there's a film of him doing the jig as he's mocking the French.
Mhm. Okay.
Hey,
Sandra has just joined us and he sent us greetings, peace, and love in life.
so I don't want to create too bleak of a picture. There's
Okay.
something really powerful about being a
Mhm.
good person.
Mhm.
Otherwise, these leaders wouldn't spend so much time trying to kill all these families. World
Yes.
War II began the extermination of families.
Mhm.
Before that, it was considered, for the most part,
Mhm.
that most armies fought on a battleground and did not include women and children and elderly, that it was
Yes.
armies that would determine it. Then
Mhm.
World War II, and it's sort of a takeoff from Genghis and Kublai Khan,
Mhm.
because if you resisted Genghis Khan, he would kill and enslave a whole city or country.
Mhm.
World War II was directed at civilians. 70%
Mhm.
of the casualties, like at Dresden or
Mhm.
V1, V2 bombings of London, these
Mhm.
psychopathic leaders, which goes to the wars today, directed their bombs and missiles at
mhm,
civilian population. They
mhm,
were terrorists.
mhm,
They decided to kill whole cities of innocent people.
mhm,
And we see that with the invasion of Poland,
mhm.
Hitler and Stalin. They didn't care. They were going to exterminate the Polish people.
Yes,
But they couldn't.
and
They didn't.
yes,
They were going to
yes,
exterminate the Jews. They couldn't do
mm,
it. So there
yes,
is something divine. There is something that's resisting these brutal psychopaths that rule the human race.
mhm. So it means the good and bad people are everywhere.
Right.
Mm.
And the bad
And
people are busy figuring out how to economically blockade, cause trouble, and
mhm,
manipulate the good people.
mhm.
It gets
And
to
the
be
good
like
people.
religion. It
Mhm.
really something evil's in control of the world. And
Yes.
my prediction is they're going to
Mhm.
try to start a world war again.
Yes.
And we're
And
in the
I think,
preliminary stages.
yeah, I think it is going to be a different kind of war, or it is going to be, it could be just like medicine, pharmaceutical
Yeah.
company, tech companies, or could be something else.
Yeah, it's important to realize mind control went from military force, that's the Romans.
Hmm.
The Romans saw military force couldn't do the mind control
Hmm.
because good people could resist it.
Hmm.
So they went to religion.
Hmm.
Then from
Just.
religion failed because it became clear the religious leaders were criminals.
Hmm. And that
So
was,
after religion failed, it was nationalism.
yes.
And as nationalism failed, communism arose.
Hmm.
And then communism developed its own form of capitalism or industrialization. And now
Hmm.
we're at mind control by pharmaceutical drug lords.
Yes,
So it
and
moved from,
I would like to add here the tech companies. They are also playing a major role in controlling the minds of people.
yes, we see that on all the social media. They're trying to
Yes,
they're trying to claim, they're
mhm,
the truth committees.
yes, yes,
They have the truth and the rest of us are too stupid, so they got to protect us from
mhm,
fake news when the fake news is propaganda. We have a
mhm,
propaganda block that is
mhm.
throughout the world.
Yes, and
Before it
they
was just
are
the Iron Curtain.
they are the deciding factor. They are deciding that what is good for us and what is bad for us. So they block the information that it is not goes against the community standards
But we're
or
still
whatever.
out here. But we're
Yes,
still here.
yes,
Let
yes.
me sort of me um, um, emphasize my evolution of mind control, my view of
Mm.
it. So
Okay.
first it was military force.
Mm-hmm.
Then that didn't work, so it went to religion.
Mm-hmm.
Then that didn't work, it went to patriotism and nationalism.
Yes. I
And
think
then that
it was.
didn't work,
Mm-hmm.
it went to communism.
Mm-hmm.
And communism was one political party.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't work, then it goes to the two political party system. The
Mm-hmm.
mind control in the West is done by political parties. You either belong to one or the other. And the
Mm-hmm.
people are so mind controlled, if you
Mm-hmm.
disagree in the US with the Republicans,
Mm-hmm.
you're seen as a Democrat, even though you're not a Democrat, because you
Mm-hmm.
disagree with the Republicans. The mind control is so extensive, you're stereotyped as a Democrat. If you
Yeah.
disagree with the Democrats,
Mm-hmm.
the mind control is so extensive, then you're portrayed as a Republican. They're the only
Mm-hmm.
two religions allowed,
Mm-hmm.
Republicans or Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And
We have
if you don't
we have
belong to one of them, you're crazy.
yes, and we have a comment here from Sandra.
Yeah, it's divine to have the general godness in your heart. I think there is a spiritual feminine powerful inspiration and also spiritual male influence
mhm,
that we're not as well aware of because it's been misused, because
mhm,
God has been betrayed
mhm,
too much and his so-called teachers or prophets as males.
mhm,
So the female divine aspects are
mhm,
easier to detect because they haven't been as distorted as
mhm,
the male. But I do
mhm,
think human beings have the capability of being inspired by a higher thinking and a higher feeling of love. And this is
mhm,
so powerful.
mhm,
The criminals in power have to spend trillions of
mhm,
dollars at trying to create war, mind
mhm,
control, drugs, because good people, a few good people, are
mhm.
really that powerful.
Mhm. Speaking of, you just mentioned, and it reminds me, you speak of higher power, and I know we have discussed it in the comments and also in the messenger while texting, and that was there any higher power involved helping the Hitlers to achieve the technological success at a very short time? Because
Well,
it makes.
yeah, it looks like there is.
Yes.
And I call that the X factor, the X
Mm,
being unknown. And
mhm,
it could be another civilization in Antarctica. It could be aliens. It could
mhm,
be powerful ghosts. Now, I actually have a theory that
mhm.
I don't want to make public yet. It has to
Okay.
do with the Ark of the Covenant or the
Mhm,
Ark of the Contract, secret societies.
mhm.
There's a,
Because the X factor is the only thing that makes sense. Because Hitler comes to power in 1933, and he starts the war in 1939, and it was only comprised of 6 years. And in 6 years is a very short time to uh, to prepare for the World War. And in the 1933, Germany wasn't in a position economically to go to start industrialization at a mass scale. But in 1939, only 6 years later, and she was ready to start the war uh, against the whole world. It doesn't make sense.
no, it
Only the
doesn't
X
make sense.
factor, only the X factor makes it possible.
Yeah, the religions call that the great Satan,
Mhm,
or people, others call it aliens from another. And I think it's tricky, which is we have a lot of evidence for the mind control I discussed and the what I discussed in World War II in regards to China,
mhm,
Japan, Russia, or the Soviet
mhm,
Union, England, the
mhm,
oil fields. You can document that pretty easily. There's a lot of evidence for that.
mhm,
When we get to the X factor, which is
mhm,
what is keeping
mhm,
psychopathic leaders in power on the
mhm,
world,
mhm,
it's totally hidden. But if you read the
mhm,
art of warfare, the art of
mhm.
warfare is deception, to be
Yes,
totally hidden.
yes.
So whatever humankind, and I
Mhm,
emphasize humankind, is
mhm,
facing is hidden. And
mhm,
if we speculate about what is the X factor, it
mhm,
is there is a telepathic level to it.
mhm,
I'm working. I don't know. I haven't. I've been talking to someone who is hopefully getting a master's degree in history, and I was hoping to write a book with her
mhm.
on what the X factor is.
Okay. Yeah, I would love
It,
to read that.
it's going to take it would it's going to take it takes a lot of development. I mean, you
Mhm,
see just by the links I sent you all the
mhm.
reading involved.
Yes.
Get to the next level to understand the secret societies, which is
Mhm,
we talked about mind control, from
yes.
brutal military force to religion
Mhm,
to patriotism and now to fraudulent science.
mhm.
But
And I
then
think you.
this
Mhm.
this is based
To patriotism, to capitalism, then to the through the pharmaceutical
Actually,
companies.
a lot of feudalism had to first go, particularly in Europe and Asia, to
Mhm,
communism and a one-party system, and
mhm,
then the two-party system is emerging, which is in
mhm,
the United States, mind control is mostly done by the two-party system. You're
mhm,
stereotyped as a Republican or a Democrat, and you're supposed to be mind control in that. And if you reject both parties, you're seen as
mhm,
crazy. But
mhm,
getting back to where did this is called Republicanism.
mhm.
And historically, it's confusing because there's been no democracy. We hear all this democracy. There never was democracy. That's
Yes.
a lie. The
Mhm,
80% of the Greeks were slaves.
mhm,
There's no democracy.
mhm,
It's a delusion. So
mhm,
the removal of noble families from power, which we
mhm,
see in the French Revolution, is called
mhm,
republicanism. A
mhm,
republic is based upon bureaucracy, not upon royalty. So you
mhm,
remove the royalty element, you have
mhm,
republicanism, and republicanism arose from the secret societies. The
mhm,
professional soldiers were the engineers. They built the bridges, they built the catapults, they built the roads, they dealt with supply problems, repair of wagons,
mhm,
industrialization, making bridges, buildings, and these soldiers formed secret societies, and a mercantilist class emerged, you
mhm,
know, Medici family
mhm,
specifically, that began
mhm,
to compete with the monarchies. So the
mhm,
monarchies went after the secret societies, like Philip IV in France. He owed money to Jews and to Knights Templar, and rather than pay him back, he executed, he tortured, and imprisoned the Knights Templar. Knights Templars were a secret military order. So the
mhm.
mercantilist class, which is the
Mhm,
capitalist class, developed from the secret societies, and they overthrew the monarchies. And
mhm.
they tended to
And
be not using religion.
mhm,
We are now in the result of these secret orders that
mhm.
rose to corporations and are now controlling the world through pharmaceutical racketeering.
Yeah, and it was the period of Renaissance and Reformation period, and that was the beginning of that was the beginning for the foundation of secret society. Or secret society were laying their foundation
Well,
during the.
they were always there. If you read about the
Mhm,
Mamluks
mhm,
and then the Ottoman Empire, you'll see soldiers would take an oath. They were called war slaves. They weren't
mhm,
war slaves. They were bound by oaths.
mhm, mhm.
You can't call people who became mayors or governors or caliphs. You can't call
Mhm.
them slaves. They were the rulers.
Yes.
This is what the secret societies were called slaves because they were obligated by oaths to the
Mhm,
order. They couldn't, they
mhm.
were not really free men. They were
Yes.
obligated by oaths, but
Mhm.
they became
And
the rulers.
mhm. And we have got a very good comment here from Sandra. It isn't democracy, 51% versus 49%. So it is only the difference is only 1%, and we have got the winner.
Yeah, it's silly. It's absolutely
Mhm,
absurd. What we really
mhm,
want is pluralism.
mhm,
Pluralism is we give individual and group rights. We allow different points of view and belief systems to exist.
mhm.
Pluralism.
Yes.
So minorities are represented. It isn't, oh, the majority voted for slavery, therefore slavery is a democratic ideal. No, it isn't.
Mhm.
Majority
Yes.
rule is tyranny.
Yes. And that's how the majority works.
Yeah. And the X
Mhm,
factor, yes, Sandra, does make sense because you turn it upside down, which is good and
mhm.
evil are easily reversed by the X
Yeah.
factor.
Yes. And I think we have covered enough in our today's session. And I think I have another idea before finalizing the globalization series in the next episode. and I think we should cover the Cold War period in the next episode. Then in the after that we should uh, finish it. What do
Yeah,
you think?
The Cold War evolved into the Corona Cold War.
Yes.
That strange, the cold
Mhm,
virus, which
mhm,
is supposedly has no cure, but now we supposedly have a vaccine for a
mhm,
coronavirus, which was
mhm,
never possible. And the
mhm,
Cold War, which was
mhm,
largely with China,
mhm,
because China was so Maoist and revolutionary,
mhm,
the interface was Hong Kong, and
mhm.
supposedly the cold viruses and the flu come from Hong Kong. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah, the colds and the viruses have always been blamed on China.
Mhm, mhm. So I think
Even
that was.
even the Black Plague, even the
Mhm,
Black Plague was blamed on China.
mhm. And I think that was the policy of Trump administration. The whole period of Trump administration was against the Chinese, and it was moving towards the Russian. And the Biden administration is against Russians, and they will move towards China.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
a change of political parties, the mind control. First mind
Yes.
control by Trump is to blame China. Second
Hmm.
mind control by the Democrats is to blame the Russians. And I know I have lost even a best friend.
Hmm.
They're convinced Russia controlled or interfered in our elections. And I
Hmm.
know other people who are convinced that Chinese navies and armies are ready to invade the US.
Hmm. But okay, we have, I think, covered enough in our
Yes.
today's discussion, and we will either finalize it in the next one, in the next episode, or the next. And thank you for your time, and thank you for helping me and helping Sandra and many other people and Mike to connect the dots. I knew there was many things I knew, but I didn't know the connection among them. And thank you so much for helping me and helping other people to connect the dots. You are a great person. And thank you guys for your time for watching us. If you have any question, leave it in the comment box below, and I will answer it to you as soon as I can, or Ed will answer it to you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye now.